San Francisco, open up your gate. Hurry, hurry, San Francisco, please don't make us wait.
Welcome back to The Place of Places, an analysis of William Saroyan's 1972 memoir, Places Where I've Done Time. Today we dig deeper into Chapter 8, Postal Telegraph Office, 651 Market Street, San Francisco, 1927. On the surface, this is sort of a hodgepodge of places and times. It's like the whole book summarized in one chapter. It gives a few previews of future chapters as well. But really, this is a chapter about how we see ourselves and how others see us. He begins at the Palace Hotel, a grand building in which a small corner housed the Postal Telegraph Office. The Palace Hotel was historic even in 1927, being originally built in 1875, burned down in the 1906 fire, and rebuilt into the new Palace Hotel in 1909. It was a special place. Woodrow Wilson gave a speech about the League of Nations there in 1919, and Warren G. Harding died there in the middle of his presidential term in 1923. So it's 1927, and William is just a month past his 19th birthday, working in this glorious building. But he's been working for the telegraph office for years, around San Francisco and in Fresno. He describes San Francisco at this point as being in his blood and bones. Then he proceeds to list the times in his life that he had known the city, even before he moved there as a teenager. He starts with knowing it as a small child. This refers to a brief time in which his father, Arminach, worked as a preacher for the Salvation Army. Very little is known about this time period, but a 1910 census shows the family living within the city limits. Judging by the precinct and the location of the Salvation Army Western headquarters on Valencia, the Saroyans probably lived in the Mission District, well known for housing new immigrants. We'll pause on this slide for a little while for you to look at the information transcribed below the census image. Then, William says he knew the city a little later, as a whistling boy waiting for his mother to come home from work. We'll get to know a little more about this in a later chapter, but this refers to a brief time, probably in 1913, when William was barely school age. Takui removed him from the Fred Finch orphanage and installed him in her furnished room on Laguna Street. But her long work hours meant that he was something of a latchkey kid, getting home before her and getting into trouble. He refers to a school he attended at this time on McAllister and Franklin. This may be the Hayes Valley School, pictured here. The orphanage decided that these conditions weren't in his best interest, and he returned to his siblings in Oakland. Returning to Oakland, he and Takui took a ferry, and then a streetcar to the orphanage, where they picnicked with the older Saroyan kids on a hill overlooking San Francisco and the bay. This was before any bridges were built in the bay, and ferries were the form of public transportation to the north or east of San Francisco. In 1915, a caretaker at the orphanage brought a group of boys to the Panama Pacific Exposition, another place we will revisit in a later chapter. So, William is less than 10 years old, looking over the bay at the city, thinking, I know its streets. It's impossible to know what those first 10 years of his life were like, filled with tragedy and resilience. In another chapter, we learn that he was chastised for crying when his mother left him at the orphanage, him age 3. He was expected to persevere with very little family support in those orphanage years. Feeling like he was in control, like he knew such a city as San Francisco, even as a little kid, this is probably what calmed him and gave him a modicum of confidence in such a messy world. His own perception of himself was as a tough kid who understood the workings of a city at age 5. He returns the reader back to the Postal Telegraph office, 14 years after his stint on Laguna Street. There he encounters the writer, Lincoln Steffens, with his neat little mustache and a neat little Van Dyke beard, and his pince-nez glasses. Stevens seems to be agonizing over writing a telegram for an hour. Saroyan describes him as nervous, like so many writers, novelists, historians, and humorists. Lincoln Steffens was an investigative journalist, known for his muckraking style that targeted government and political corruption. Muckraker refers to the reform-minded journalists in the progressive era of American history, from the 1890s to the 1920s, that sought to expose corruption. Steffens often worked with the popular magazine McClures to publish his articles. His memoirs came out in 1931, which Saroyan tells us he read and which made him think of Steffens back in the Telegraph office. But this leads Saroyan to consider the personalities of writers. Was Steffens normally a nervous fellow? And how about one of his idols, Mark Twain, who came off as supremely confident with his wit, brandishing his cigar for emphasis? Saroyan informs us that Twain's household staff had written about him being keyed up, always nervous, frequently a nervous wreck. And then he follows with a story about his uncle Arum, describing him to university students as nervous, making William roar with laughter, that this was Arum's takeaway from knowing him and even helping raise him. In this telling, Uncle Arum was 70 and William 55. But William's son Arum also wrote an article for the Los Angeles Times in 1990 that describes a similar occasion in the 1930s when Uncle Arum was interviewed by a local paper about William and described him as nervous then, too. He comes back to this place in the chapter, the Postal Telegraph office, and concludes that if Steffens was nervous writing a telegram at age 40 in 1927, he wasn't half as nervous as William at age 19 about everything. This is a pretty introspective piece. He suggests that you have to convey confidence sometimes just in order to survive, or to emotionally persist, as he did when he was a child. But as he grew older, understood more of the world, and eventually was overcome with sudden fame, that false confidence wore on him, and his anxiety could only be expressed and worked through in writing. In another piece, William described his writing as therapy. Maybe it's in the nature of people who deconstruct their world and others with words. Maybe Twain really was a mess, observing so keenly the foibles of his fellow man and hiding how much they affected him. How we see ourselves, what we choose to show others, how others see us regardless, these are the topics at hand in this chapter. It's a subtle but satisfying look into how he saw his profession and its value or purpose, taking on the sins of mankind and churning out nervous wrecks in the wake. Saroyan did convey a coolness in the media, with his jaunty hat and his witty quips, but throughout his memoirs we get a deeper sense of the chaos thriving within his mind, and he helps us to humanize our heroes. Let's put this on the Saroyan map and move on.